likened yourself to a spy or a detective in the first part.
We grew up in Washington.
Yes, you did. And as a spy would, you withheld your name for some time from your birth mother. I'm wondering, and then she tracked you down. I'm wondering how she found you, and if you could tell our audience a bit about
I used to make them withhold my name entirely.
Your surname.
My surname. You know, that whole piece of it was really the whole episode of being found by one's biological parents as opposed to going in search of her. So literally somebody just appearing out of the blue. What I said to her was, I actually asked for her to write me a letter telling me a little bit about herself. And I got 2 letters, and I opened the post office box, and I felt that it was going to be a process, that I wasn't ready to just sort of expose myself. And I already had somewhat of a sort of a public life, and I didn't really want to just throw myself out there or throw myself to her. And so she had my first name, her name was Amy, and she found out, she was doing some research, and she thought I was a woman who wrote books about God, actually. It wasn't true. And then she actually called Politics of Prose, the independent bookstore in Washington, and said, who is a writer named Amy from Washington? I said, it's me, A.M. Holmes. Here's your phone number. And Oscar Buelos told me it's the same story that his first wife stalked him to at one time as well. She also stalked me there later. So it's a very active independent bookstore.
My first husband showed up at a reading in California, and I didn't recognize him. So I think a lot of that kind of semi-stalking.
Exactly. I think the thing that's interesting about that is when you're giving readings and things, people come, they want to come and look at you, and they have another agenda, and it's so weird because sometimes, especially in this case, when I would read in or around Washington, I could tell there were people who had absolutely no interest in writing or fiction or anything, but they would come and they'd be like, just sort of, tell me, you want to pull Lenny Bruce thing and stop holding it? Excuse me, couldn't the guy in the back identify himself? You just want, and then you realize you're career leader or anyone else, but
unlikely.
Well,
but she did show up at a reading.
She did. She showed up at a reading. She asked if she could. She said,
unannounced.
She first said, what do I have to do? Come to Columbia University and wait in line? I said, please don't do that. Literally, the whole experience, I was 30, but it made me very small. No, not necessary. I turned into Stuart Little or something. And she showed up at this reading I was giving in Washington. My 4th grade teacher was there, my parents were there, my grandmother was there. I mean, everybody in my life was there. And I literally, the night before, this is all in the book, and stuck the New York Times in my eye and I blinded myself. So I read like this. And I had a little like window. The other eye also sort of kind of sympathetically closed with the first one, so it really was very narrow. And after I gave the reading and I'm signing on books, and I see this woman nervous in the back in front of her. And I knew immediately, and she came right up to me, she said, what did you do to your eye? And then she said, you look just like your father. It was just the whole thing. You couldn't have a nightmare like that.
That brings me to my next question before we go back to Francine. And as you discovered, she lived not far from where you grew up in Washington, D.C. You did write a novel about a character, a heroine who was adopted. Rather than in all your worst nightmares, but in a plot that you devised, would you come up with anything as close as to what happened?
The book you're talking about, Country Mothers. The strange things about it are, that book was actually in galleys, about to come out, as my biological mother found me. And the book was, I don't like the book. Other people like it. Apparently it's okay. I never felt when I was writing it like I did in the job. I never did what I wanted to do with it. And it was the only time I ever wrote anything that had even an autobiographical thread. And the novel is the story of a woman who gives a child up for adoption, marries, has another family, makes sort of another life for herself, becomes a therapist, gets this girl patient who was adopted and drives the girl crazy. She thinks it's her daughter, and she just drives the girl right over the edge. And it was my attempt to sort of reconcile what I was thinking about adoption. And I really felt like, honestly, I never went in far enough. I just couldn't do it, and whatever. And that book was just about to come out when, out of the blue, it's like, I mean, it's like I just had the power of conjuring something. And I wrote in Country of Mothers things about how the biological mother had never married, how this, how that, which all turned out to be totally true. It's like things that you sort of know instinctively about yourself and your life and all that kind of thing.
kind of one of the creepy and pleasant things about writing fiction is that it turns out you know things that you couldn't possibly know. You know, you write a character and 2 weeks later you meet the character.
Oh, yeah.
Or you make up something that you couldn't possibly know. And I mean, after I wrote A Changed Man, you know, it's about a neo-Nazi who turns himself into a human rights foundation and becomes involved with the development director who has 2 kids and da-da-da-da. The first time I gave a reading from it, a poet I know came up to me and said, my sister works for the Wiesenthal Foundation, and a neo-Nazi came and turned himself in, and she's the development director, and she has 2 kids, and then became involved. And he basically, the novel hadn't come out yet. I was reading from a manuscript, and he basically told me the entire plot of my novel.
I think there's always a lot of truth in that, because with every book I've written, there have been things that when I wrote them were not true. And by the time the book came out, like the end of Music for Torture, which actually ends with a sort of a Columbine shooting, came out 3 weeks before Columbine. Nothing had ever happened before, but that was the first watch. So I think it's about, as a writer, I feel like if I'm doing my job, I'm reading the culture and I'm reading the world we live in. And that if you're, you know, sort of good at what you do, you're pulling those threads out and trying to process them before they're completely apparent or readable to everybody else. So even though it takes us, you know, 4 years or whatever to write a book, it still also takes a long time for it to build kind of critical mass so that we're really aware of what's going on.